Sometimes the people we lose are just waiting somewhere to be found. And sometimes the truth has been hidden in plain sight all along. Wade Tillman, a 72-year-old cowboy, is caught in a deadly mountain blizzard with only his loyal donkey, May. Near collapse, they find a stone hut with a fire burning and warm food still waiting, but no one inside. Then Wade sees the photographs on the wall. His mother, who vanished in a snowstorm 60 years ago, stares back at him. The hut belonged to her first love, a mountain trapper who saved her and helped her disappear from the life she no longer wanted. What do you do when the past simply won't stay buried? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Wade Tillman had been riding through the high country for 3 days when the first flakes began to fall. They came soft at first, gentle as a whisper, touching his weathered face with the kind of cold that reminded him he was still alive. May, his 15-year-old donkey, plodded ahead with that stubborn grace only a donkey can manage, her long ears twitching at each new gust of wind that came down from the peaks above. The old cowboy shifted in his saddle, feeling the familiar ache in his lower back, the stiffness in his knees that had become his constant companions these past few years. 72 years on this earth, and most of them spent in the saddle or on his feet, working cattle, mending fence, doing the 1,000 small tasks that made up a life in ranch country. But those days were behind him now. The ranch had been sold 2 years back, after his wife Emma passed. Their son lived in Denver with a family of his own, caught up in the rush of city life, and Wade had found himself alone in a house that echoed with memories. So he'd done what seemed natural. He'd packed what he needed, saddled May, and headed into the mountains his father had loved. In his saddlebag, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the weather, was the map. His father had drawn it 50 years ago, before the cancer took him, leaving behind careful pencil marks and notations that tracked old trails through country that few people knew anymore. Wade had found it 6 months back, tucked into a book of his father's things that had sat untouched in storage for decades. The map showed a route through the Sawtooth Range, up into country that Wade had never explored. His father had marked certain places with small X's, and beside one of them, high up near the tree line, he'd written in his precise hand, "Where answers wait." Wade had stared at those words for a long time, turning them over in his mind. His father had never been a cryptic man, never one for riddles or mysteries. If he'd written that, he'd meant something by it, and there was more. At the bottom of the map, in smaller writing, almost as if his father had added it later, were the words, "For Wade, when he's ready to know about Sarah." Sarah was Wade's mother. She had disappeared when Wade was 12 years old, vanished during a winter storm while visiting her sister in the mountains. That was the story Wade had grown up with, the story his father had told him. They'd searched for weeks, dozens of men combing the mountains, but they'd never found her body. Eventually, they'd had a funeral with an empty casket, and life had moved on the way life does. But the map suggested something different. It suggested his father had known something, had kept something from him all these years. Wade wasn't angry about it. He was past the age where anger came easy. He was curious, and beneath that curiosity was something deeper, something that had been waiting in him all his life. The need to know. The need to understand the woman who'd brought him into this world and then vanished from it. May stopped suddenly, her ears pricking forward. Wade pulled himself from his thoughts and looked ahead. The trail they'd been following, already faint, seemed to disappear into a wall of aspens whose white trunks glowed in the dimming afternoon light. The snow was falling harder now, the flakes larger and more insistent. He could feel the temperature dropping, could sense in the way the wind moved that something serious was building. He dismounted, his boots sinking into 4 inches of fresh powder, and pulled the map from his saddlebag. According to his father's markings, they should be close to a place called Widow's Peak, a distinctive rock formation that would guide them to a higher trail. From there, it was another day's ride to the spot his father had marked. But the snow was coming faster, and visibility was shrinking. Wade had been in enough mountain storms to know what this meant. They had maybe an hour before this turned into something dangerous. May nuzzled his shoulder, her warm breath steaming in the cold air. He'd bought her as a foal, raised her alongside his horses, but she'd always been special. Donkeys were smarter than horses, more sure-footed in rough country, and May had proven herself 100 times over. She'd carried supplies through terrain that would have broken a horse's leg. She'd stood calm when bears passed close by, when lightning struck near enough to raise the hair on their necks. She trusted him, and he trusted her. In a life that had taken most of what he'd loved, May remained. He ran his hand along her neck, feeling the rough warmth of her winter coat. "What do you think, girl? Push on or make camp?" May turned her head and looked at him with those dark, intelligent eyes. Then she looked ahead at the trail, then back at him. It wasn't an answer exactly, but Wade had learned to read her over the years. She was telling him she'd follow wherever he led, but she was also telling him that the weather was serious. Wade looked at the map again. If they pushed on and found the rock formation, there might be shelter there. The peaks created odd wind patterns, carved out protected spots where a man and a donkey could wait out a storm. But if they didn't find it, if they got caught in open country when this storm really hit, they'd be in trouble. Real trouble. The smart thing would be to turn back, head down to lower elevations, make camp in the trees and wait it out. But Wade thought about the map, about his father's careful hand marking that spot, about the words "where answers wait." He thought about his mother, about the questions that had lived in him for 60 years. And he thought about the fact that he was 72 years old, that his knees hurt and his back hurt, and he didn't know how many more chances he'd have to make a journey like this. Sometimes the smart thing and the right thing aren't the same thing. Wade had learned that over a lifetime. Sometimes you have to choose between safety and truth, between comfort and meaning. He folded the map and tucked it back into his saddlebag, then swung himself into the saddle with a grunt. "We'll push on," he said to May. "Not far, just to the rock formation. We'll shelter there." May started forward without hesitation, her small hooves finding purchase in the snow. Wade pulled his collar up and his hat down, and together they moved into the aspen grove. The trees closed around them, their white trunks like ghost sentries, and the snow fell thicker, muffling all sound until the world became nothing but white bark and white sky and the steady rhythm of May's steps. They climbed for an hour, following the fading trail through the aspens and then out onto rockier ground where twisted pines grew stunted and sparse. The wind picked up, no longer gentle, driving the snow horizontal at times so that Wade had to turn his face away. His fingers were numb inside his gloves, and he could feel the cold working its way through his coat, settling into his bones. May kept on, her head lowered against the wind, following some instinct or memory of trail that Wade couldn't see anymore. The world had gone white, a total whiteout where earth and sky merged into one blank canvas. He knew they should stop, should hunker down and wait, but there was nowhere to hunker. They were on exposed hillside now, no trees to break the wind, nothing but rock and snow and the terrible cold. Wade's mind began to drift, the way it does when the cold gets deep enough. He thought about Emma, about the way she'd looked at him the morning of their wedding, about the sound of her laugh. He thought about his son as a boy, learning to ride, taking his first fall and getting back up without crying. He thought about his father, teaching him to read tracks in the dirt, to move quiet through the woods, to respect the land and the creatures that lived on it. And he thought about his mother. He had so few memories of her, just fragments, really. The smell of bread baking, her hands, small and strong, braiding his hair, the sound of her singing while she worked. And one memory that stood out clear, a winter evening, the two of them, alone in the house, and her telling him a story about a woman who lived in the mountains, who'd given up everything for love and lived out her days in a stone hut where the wind sang through the peaks. He'd forgotten that memory for years, hadn't thought of it in decades. But now, with the cold pressing in and the world gone white, it came back sharp and clear. Had that been just a story? Or had his mother been trying to tell him something? May stumbled and Wade jerked back to the present. The donkey caught herself, but he could feel her breathing hard, could sense her exhaustion. They couldn't go on much longer. They needed shelter now, or they would die on this mountain. He squinted ahead through the driving snow, looking for anything, a rock outcropping, a cluster of trees, a depression in the hillside. Nothing, just white emptiness and the howling wind. Then May turned sharply to the left, leaving what remained of the trail. Wade started to pull her back, but something made him stop. She was moving with purpose now, her ears forward, and he'd learned over the years that when May had a sense about something, it was usually right. They moved across the hillside, the wind pushing at them from the side now, instead of head-on. Wade could barely see past May's ears. His hands were so numb, he wasn't sure he was still holding the reins. The cold had moved past pain into something else, a deep ache that seemed to pull at his very center. Then, through the white, he saw it. Just a darker shape at first, a shadow that resolved slowly into stone. A wall, built from fitted rocks, weathered but solid. And above it, impossibly, a thin line of smoke that the wind tore away almost as soon as it appeared. May walked right up to the wall and stopped. There was a wooden door, old but sturdy, with an iron handle, and beside the door, a small window glowing with warm yellow light. Wade sat in his saddle, staring at that light. It made no sense. They were miles from anywhere, high up in country that even hunters rarely visited. No one lived up here. No one could live up here. And yet there was the light, steady and warm, promising shelter from the storm that was trying to kill them. He dismounted stiffly, his legs almost giving out beneath him. He tied May's reins to a post that stood beside the door, a hitching post, weathered grey, clearly meant for this purpose. Then he reached out with his numb hand and grasped the iron handle. The door opened easily, swinging inward, and a wave of warmth rolled out over him. He stood there on the threshold, with May pressed close behind him, and looked into the impossible room that waited inside. The interior of the stone hut was small but complete. A single room maybe 20 feet across, with a ceiling of rough-hewn beams. A fire burned in a stone hearth set into the far wall, the flames casting dancing shadows across the space. To the left stood a narrow bed covered with thick wool blankets. To the right, a table and 2 chairs, a wooden counter with shelves above it holding dishes and supplies. And against the wall near the fire, a small cast-iron stove with a pot sitting on top, steam rising from it in lazy spirals. Wade stood just inside the door, unable to move, unable to process what he was seeing. May pushed past him, drawn by the warmth, and walked straight to the center of the room as if she owned the place. She shook herself, sending snow flying, and then stood there looking at Wade as if to say, "Well, are you going to close the door?" He closed the door. The sound of the wind immediately muffled to a distant howl. The warmth wrapped around him like a blanket, and he felt his frozen fingers begin to tingle with returning sensation. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt a growing sense of unreality, as if he'd stepped through that door into some place that shouldn't exist. The pot on the stove smelled like stew. Not old stew, not something that had been sitting for days. Fresh stew simmering ready to eat. Wade walked slowly to the stove, his snow-crusted boots leaving wet prints on the wooden floor. He lifted the lid and looked inside. Venison stew with carrots and potatoes, steam rising thick and fragrant. He touched the side of the pot with his bare hand, pulled back from the heat. Someone had been here recently. Someone had made this stew, fed the fire, left the lamp burning on the table. But where were they? And why would they leave food cooking and a door unlocked in the middle of a blizzard? Wade turned slowly, taking in the details. The bed was made, the blankets pulled tight and neat. The table was clean, 2 tin plates stacked on it with 2 tin cups. Everything was orderly, cared for, but also old. The furniture had the worn look of things that had been used for decades. The shelves held old mason jars with preserved food, their metal lids spotted with age. The walls were bare stone, chinked with mud and moss, except for Wade's breath caught. On the wall above the bed, in simple wooden frames, hung 3 photographs. Even from across the room, even in the flickering firelight, he knew them. Or rather, he knew one of them. He walked to the bed, his legs moving on their own, his mind disconnected from his body. He stopped in front of the photographs and stared. The first showed a woman in her 20s standing in front of this very hut. She wore a plain dress and a shawl, her dark hair pulled back from her face. She wasn't smiling, but her eyes held something, a contentment, a peace. Wade knew that face. He'd seen it in the few photographs his father had kept, had seen it in his own reflection as he aged. His mother, Sarah Tillman. The second photograph showed the same woman, older now, maybe in her 30s. She sat at the table, this table in this room, with a book open in front of her. She was looking at the camera with an expression Wade couldn't quite read. Not sadness, but something like it. A distant longing, perhaps, or regret. The third photograph showed his mother again, older still, her hair grey at the temples. She stood outside the hut with a man. He was tall and lean, with a weathered face and the kind of hands that showed a lifetime of hard work. He had his arm around her shoulders, and they both looked at the camera with simple, quiet dignity. The kind of look that people who've built a life together wear without thinking about it. Wade reached out and touched the frame of the first photograph, his hand trembling. It couldn't be. His mother had died when he was 12. Everyone said so. There had been a search, a funeral, a gravestone. His father had mourned her for the rest of his life, had never remarried, had kept her memory like a sacred thing. But here she was, in photographs that showed her alive and well, living in this stone hut in the high mountains. Living with a man who was not Wade's father. He sat down heavily on the bed, the implications crashing over him like a wave. His mother hadn't died in that storm 60 years ago. She'd left. She'd left him and his father and the life they'd had, and she'd come here to live with someone else. And his father had known. The map proved that. His father had known, and he'd never told Wade. He'd let Wade grow up believing his mother was dead, had let him mourn her, had let him build his life on that foundation of loss. May walked over and pushed her nose against Wade's shoulder. He reached up absently and stroked her neck, his eyes never leaving the photographs, questions piled up in his mind, each one leading to 10 more. How had his mother survived that storm? How had she ended up here? Who was the man in the photograph? Had she loved him? Had she ever thought about the son she'd left behind? And why? This was the question that cut deepest. Why hadn't his father told him the truth? Wade stood and walked around the small room, looking more carefully now. There were books on a shelf beside the bed, their spines worn from reading. He pulled one down and opened it. Inside the cover, in familiar handwriting, was written, Sarah Tillman, 1958. He put it back and pulled down another. Same handwriting, different year. He went through several more. The dates ranged from 1955 to 1991. Wade did the math. His mother would have been in her 60s then. She'd lived here for nearly 40 years after her supposed death. 40 years in this stone hut, while Wade grew up, got married, had a son, built a life thinking his mother was in the ground. He walked to the counter and opened the drawers. Utensils, tools, candles. In one drawer, he found letters, a whole stack of them tied with string. He pulled them out and carried them to the table, sitting down in one of the chairs. His hands shook as he untied the string and opened the first envelope. The letter inside was dated August 1965. It was addressed to no one. Just started mid-thought, as if the writer had been continuing a conversation. The aspens are turning early this year. Thomas says it means a hard winter coming. We've been cutting extra wood and preserving everything we can from the garden. I thought of you today when I saw an elk cow with her calf in the meadow below the hut. She was teaching it where to find the tender grass, how to watch for danger. I wonder if you taught our boy the same things. I wonder if he knows how to read the land, how to move through the world. I wonder if he thinks of me, or if you've told him I'm gone forever. There was no signature, but Wade didn't need one. His mother's handwriting, preserved in ink, speaking to his father across the years. He opened another letter, this one from 1972. Thomas repaired the roof where the snow damaged it last winter. He's slowing down, I can see it. We're both getting old up here, though I suppose we're getting old everywhere. I dreamed about the boy last night. He was grown in my dream, with a family of his own. He looked happy. I hope that's true. I hope he found happiness despite what I did. Wade went through more letters, jumping through years. 1980, 1985, 1989. They were all the same. His mother writing to his father, telling him about her life, asking about Wade. Never quite explaining why she'd left, but always carrying the weight of that leaving in every line. In the last letter, dated November 1991, his mother wrote, "I'm tired. John, more tired than I've ever been. Thomas passed last spring, and without him this place is too quiet. I keep the fire going and the stove warm because that's what we always did, but I'm not sure why anymore. I think it's time. I think I'm ready to rest now. Tell the boy, if you ever tell him, that I loved him. That leaving him was the hardest thing I ever did. That I thought about him every single day. Tell him I'm sorry." Wade set the letter down and put his head in his hands. The fire crackled in the hearth. The wind howled outside. May stood near the stove warming herself, and Wade sat at his mother's table, in his mother's house, reading his mother's words, and felt everything he'd ever known about his life crack open like ice in spring. His father had received these letters. For decades, he'd received them and read them and kept their secret. He'd known his wife was alive, living up here with another man, and he'd never told Wade. Why? To protect him? To protect her? To protect the memory of what they'd once had? Wade didn't know, and his father was 20 years in the ground, beyond the reach of questions. But someone had to know. Someone had been here recently enough to cook this stew, to keep the fire burning. Maybe Thomas, the man in the photograph, had family. Maybe there were people in the valleys below who knew about this place, about the woman who'd lived here, about the story Wade was only now beginning to piece together. He stood and walked to the door, opened it a crack. The blizzard was raging full force now, the wind screaming, the snow so thick he couldn't see 5 feet beyond the doorway. They weren't going anywhere tonight, maybe not tomorrow either. They were trapped here, in this place where his mother had lived out her secret life, with nothing but her belongings and her letters and the questions that multiplied with every answer Wade found. Wade closed the door against the storm and stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle over him. His body ached from the cold and the riding, but his mind was far from rest. Still, there were practical matters to attend to. May needed care. He needed food and warmth. The questions could wait until he and his donkey were secure. He found a wooden bucket near the door and filled it with snow from just outside, setting it near the fire to melt. There was no barn or shed attached to the hut, but someone had thought of animals. There was a wooden bin in the corner filled with hay, still good despite its age, and another with oats. Wade spread a pile of hay on the floor near the door, away from the fire but sheltered from drafts, and May settled onto it with a satisfied grunt. He gave her a portion of oats and the melted snow to drink, and she ate with the calm of an animal that knew she was safe. With May tended, Wade turned to his own needs. He shrugged off his coat, heavy with melted snow, and hung it on a peg by the door. His gloves followed, then his hat. His clothes underneath were damp, and he knew he should change, but the warmth of the fire was already working on him, pulling the cold from his bones. He ladled stew into one of the tin bowls and sat at the table. The first bite was a shock, not just warm but delicious. Rich broth, tender meat, vegetables cooked to perfection. Someone who knew how to cook, who'd spent years perfecting this simple dish. His mother. Or Thomas, the man from the photograph. Wade ate slowly, each spoonful a small comfort against the chaos in his mind. When the bowl was empty, he washed it in a basin of water that sat on the counter, then dried it and set it back on the shelf. The simple domestic act felt strange in this place that was becoming less and less strange with each passing minute. The hut felt lived in, cared for, loved. It wasn't a hunting shelter or a temporary camp. It was a home. Wade returned to the shelf of books and examined them more carefully. There were practical guides: how to preserve food, how to identify edible plants, how to treat common ailments with herbs. There were novels, most of them old and well-read, their pages soft from handling. And there was a journal, bound in leather, its cover worn smooth. He carried the journal to the table and opened it. His mother's handwriting filled the pages, neat and measured. The first entry was dated April 1955, just a few months before she'd disappeared. "I'm writing this because I need to put the truth somewhere, even if no one ever reads it. I need to say out loud what I can barely admit to myself. I don't know how to be the person everyone expects me to be anymore. I don't know how to wake up each day and pretend that this life is enough, that I'm not dying a little inside every morning." Wade read on. The entries painted a picture he'd never imagined. His mother had been unhappy. Not dramatic, not theatrical about it, but deeply, quietly unhappy in a way that had worn at her for years. She wrote about feeling trapped, about the expectations placed on a rancher's wife, about the life that seemed to narrow with each passing year. She wrote about loving Wade, about the guilt of feeling that even her son wasn't enough to fill the emptiness. And she wrote about Thomas Bridger, a trapper and guide who'd worked occasionally for Wade's grandfather. A man who lived alone in the mountains, who came down twice a year to sell furs and buy supplies. A man who'd shown Sarah another way to live, another way to be. They'd fallen in love over the course of 2 years, meeting secretly when Thomas came through, writing letters in between. It wasn't sudden or impulsive. It was slow and certain, the kind of love that builds like sediment, layer by layer, until it's bedrock. The journal detailed the plan. Thomas would be guiding a party up into the Sawtooth Range in December. There would be a storm. He could read weather the way other men read books. Sarah would join her sister's family for a Christmas visit, a normal thing that wouldn't raise suspicion. On the way back, when the storm hit, she would disappear. Thomas would find her, as if by accident, and bring her to the hut. The search party would find no trace, because there would be no trace to find. And Sarah Tillman would become Sarah Bridger, living in a stone hut above the world. Wade closed the journal and stared at the fire. His mother had planned her own death. She'd walked away from her life, from her husband, from her 12-year-old son, and she'd done it deliberately. The knowledge sat in his chest like a stone. He wanted to be angry. Part of him was angry, but another part, the part that had lived 72 years and knew something about the weight of an unlived life, understood. Not agreed with, but understood. His mother had been drowning in the life she had, and she'd chosen to swim for different shores. It was selfish. It was cruel in its way, but it was also profoundly human. Wade stood and walked around the small space, restless despite his exhaustion. On the mantel above the fire, he found small objects arranged with care. A smooth river stone, a pine cone, perfectly preserved, a bird's nest delicate and intricate, each one a small treasure, marking time and attention. Behind the stove, he found a wooden crate filled with old newspapers, yellowed and brittle. He pulled one out carefully. It was from 1976, a regional paper from the town of Cedar Springs, 30 miles west. The headline announced the completion of a new highway. Reed smiled despite himself. His mother had kept up with the world. Even from up here, he found other crates. One held clothes, neatly folded, men's work shirts and pants, his mother's dresses. Another held tools for maintenance and repair. Everything spoke of 2 people who'd built a careful, intentional life together. Nothing was random. Nothing was careless. On a small shelf near the bed, Wade found photographs he hadn't noticed before. These weren't framed, just loose prints in a wooden box. He went through them slowly. His mother and Thomas in different seasons, different years. His mother reading, Thomas chopping wood. The 2 of them standing in front of a garden, growing older together, their faces weathering but their eyes remaining clear. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in cloth, Wade found a photograph of himself. He was maybe 10 in the picture, standing next to his father in front of the barn. He was grinning, gap-toothed, holding a rope. It was a photo he remembered. His father had taken it the day Wade learned to throw a proper lasso. His mother had kept it. She'd brought it with her to this isolated place and kept it safe all these years. She hadn't forgotten him. She'd thought about him, remembered him, maybe even missed him while living her chosen life. Wade sat on the edge of the bed, the photograph in his hands, and felt something shift in his chest. The anger was still there and the hurt and the confusion, but beneath it all was something else, a kind of sad recognition. His mother had been a person before she was his mother. She'd had dreams and needs and a right to her own life, even if the way she'd claimed it had broken something in him. Outside, the wind continued its assault on the stone walls, but inside, the fire burned steady and warm, just as it had burned for decades, tended by hands that had chosen this solitude over everything else. Wade woke before dawn. Though in the darkness of the storm, it was hard to tell when dawn had actually come. The fire had burned down to coals, and the hut was cold. He stirred the coals and added wood, coaxing flames back to life. May was still asleep on her bed of hay, snoring softly in that way donkeys do. The sound was comforting, normal, in a place where nothing else felt normal. He found coffee in one of the jars on the shelf and made a pot on the stove. Real coffee, good quality, carefully preserved. As it brewed, he returned to the letters, this time looking for his father's side of the story. There had to be responses. His mother's letters all seemed to be part of a conversation, answering questions, responding to news. There had to be letters going the other direction. He found them in a different drawer, tied with a different string. His father's handwriting, precise and measured, writing to the woman he'd loved and lost, but who wasn't really lost at all. Wade untied the string with hands that trembled slightly and began to read. The first letter was dated January 1956, a month after his mother's disappearance. Sarah, I received your letter through the person you specified. I won't pretend this doesn't hurt. It does. But I also can't pretend I didn't see it coming. You were fading away, becoming less and less yourself each year. I watched it happen and didn't know how to stop it. Maybe I didn't want to see how unhappy you were. Maybe I hoped that if I just worked harder, provided better, things would somehow fix themselves. I was wrong. I know that now. You needed something I couldn't give you, and Thomas could. I'm trying not to hate him for that. I'm trying not to hate you either, though some days are harder than others. The boy asks about you constantly. I tell him what we agreed, that you got caught in the storm, that we couldn't find you. He cries at night. I hear him through the walls. I don't know what to tell him except the lies we've built. Wade set the letter down and took a sip of coffee. His hand shook and some of the hot liquid sloshed onto his fingers. He barely noticed. His father had known. Not just known, but participated. He'd helped cover it up, had carried the burden of that secret for the rest of his life. He read another letter from 1960. Wade is growing strong. He's good with the horses. Better than I was at his age. He has your eyes, your way of looking at things, like he's trying to understand them from the inside out. He asks about you less now. I don't know if that's good or not. Sometimes I want to tell him. The words are right there, and I think maybe if he knew you were alive somewhere, happy, it would hurt less than thinking you're dead. But then I remember what we agreed. That telling him would only burden him with a secret he shouldn't have to carry. That it's better this way, cleaner. I don't know if I believe that anymore. I don't know what I believe. The letters continued through the years, documenting Wade's life from his father's perspective. His first girlfriend, his high school graduation, his decision to stay on the ranch instead of going to college, his marriage to Emma, the birth of Wade's son, all of it written to a woman who'd chosen to leave, all of it carried by messengers Wade would never know about. Probably old mountain men who moved between the high country and the valleys, people who lived outside normal society and kept their own counsel. In a letter from 1982, his father wrote, I'm sick. The doctor says cancer, says I have maybe a year. I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of dying without setting things right. I made a map. I marked where you are. I'm leaving it for Wade, though. I'm not sure when he'll find it or what he'll do when he does. Maybe he'll burn it. Maybe he'll make the journey. I hope he does. I hope he goes to you and you can explain what I never could. Why we did this. Why we thought keeping secrets was kinder than telling truth. I hope he understands. I hope he forgives us both. Wade stood and walked to the window. The snow had let up slightly, the wind less fierce, but it was still coming down steady. They'd be here another day at least, maybe longer. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass and closed his eyes. His whole life had been built on a lie. Not a malicious lie, maybe, but a lie nonetheless. His mother wasn't dead. His father had known. And both of them had decided that Wade was better off not knowing. They'd made that choice for him, and he'd lived with the consequences without ever knowing there was a choice being made. He thought about his own son, grown now with children of his own. What would Wade have done in his father's position? If Emma had left, if she'd found someone else and wanted to disappear, would Wade have helped her? Would he have lied to their son? He wanted to think he wouldn't. He wanted to believe he'd have been honest. Damn the consequences. But he also knew that love was complicated and that people did strange things when trying to protect the people they cared about. May stood and stretched, then walked over to where Wade stood. She pushed her nose against his hand, and he stroked her neck absently. "What do you think, girl?" he said quietly. "Was my father right to keep this from me?" May, of course, had no answer, but her presence was answer enough. Some things you did, alone, but some things you needed a companion for, even if that companion was a donkey who couldn't understand a word you said. Wade returned to the letters and kept reading. His father's tone changed over the years. The early letters were full of pain and anger, raw emotion, barely controlled. The middle letters were matter-of-fact, updating Sarah on practical matters, Wade's life, the ranch. But the later letters, the ones from the final years of his father's life, were different. They were gentler, more reflective. One from 1983, the year his father died, stood out. "I think I understand now why you left. Not just the surface reasons, but the deeper ones. You needed to be more than what our life allowed. You needed to be yourself in a way that our town, our circumstances, wouldn't permit. I'm sorry I couldn't see that when it mattered. I'm sorry I couldn't be the kind of man who could let you go with grace instead of grief. But I want you to know that I don't blame you anymore. I don't blame Thomas either. You found something real up there, something that sustained you. That's more than a lot of people find in a whole lifetime. I'm glad you had that. I'm glad you were happy." Wade read the last line again. His father had forgiven her, not immediately, not easily, but eventually. He'd let go of the anger and made his peace with what had happened, and he'd done it while still protecting Wade from the truth, still carrying that burden alone. The question was whether Wade could do the same. Could he forgive his mother for leaving? Could he forgive his father for hiding the truth? Could he forgive himself for the anger he felt, the sense of betrayal that sat like acid in his throat? He didn't know, but he had time to figure it out. The storm would keep him here, trapped with his mother's memory and his father's secrets, until it decided to let him go. The storm raged on through the second day. Wade spent the morning going through Thomas's things, trying to understand the man his mother had chosen over his father. It felt intrusive, picking through another man's life, but Wade needed to know. He needed to understand what had been worth leaving everything for. Thomas Bridger had been a methodical man. That was clear from his belongings. In a wooden chest, beneath the bed, Wade found journals going back decades, each one filled with observations about weather, animal movements, seasonal changes. Thomas had been a student of the mountains, learning their patterns the way scholars learn languages. One entry from 1957 read, "First snow came 2 weeks early. The elk moved down from the high country on October 15th. Same day the aspens lost their last leaves." Sarah says it reminds her of poetry, the way everything has its time and place. She's teaching me to see beauty where I only saw pattern before. Another, from 1964, fixed the north wall, where the wind had worked a stone loose. Sarah made bread while I worked. When I came in, she had it waiting with butter and honey. We ate in silence, but it was the kind of silence that says more than words. After 30 years alone, I'd forgotten what it was like to share space with another person. I'd forgotten how good it could be. Wade read entry after entry, watching his mother and Thomas's life unfold in Thomas's careful handwriting. They'd built a garden in a sheltered spot below the hut. They'd developed a system for preserving food that would last through the long winters. They'd marked trails and safe passages through the mountains, creating a map of their world. Thomas wrote about his past too, though sparingly. He'd come west as a young man, running from something he never quite named. He'd found work as a trapper and guide, but what he'd really found was solitude. He'd built the hut with his own hands over the course of 2 years, hauling stone from a quarry 3 miles away, cutting timber from the forest, learning through trial and error how to create a place that would stand against the mountain winters. He'd never expected to share it with anyone. In one entry from 1955, before Sarah came, he wrote, "I'm 45 years old and have lived alone since I was 20. I have made peace with that. I have made a life that suits me. But sometimes, when the wind is particularly fierce or the nights particularly long, I wonder what it would be like to hear another voice, to have someone know my name." Sarah had given him that, and he'd given her something too, a place where she could be herself without explanation or apology. Wade found receipts and records showing that Thomas had gone down to Cedar Springs twice a year, selling furs and buying supplies. The purchases were always practical: flour, sugar, coffee, nails, cloth. But Wade noticed that starting in 1956, the purchases expanded to include things like books, writing paper, lamp oil for reading. Thomas had adapted his life to accommodate Sarah's needs. In a small wooden box, Wade found letters from people he'd never heard of, mountain folk, hermits and trappers and guides who'd visited the hut over the years. They wrote about the weather, about game movements, about mutual friends, and they wrote about Sarah. One letter from someone named Frank Carson, dated 1970, stood out. "Thomas, I stopped by the hut last week on my way through to check the trap lines. Met your Sarah properly for the first time. She made me coffee, and we talked for a couple hours. She's got a good head on her shoulders, that woman. Asked smart questions about the country, about how to read the signs. You did good, old friend. Not many men find what you found. Hold on to it." So there had been others who knew. Not many, but a few. People who lived outside conventional society, who understood that sometimes a person needed to step away from the world and build something different. They'd kept the secret, this small community of mountain dwellers, protecting Sarah and Thomas's privacy. Wade walked to the window and looked out at the storm. It was weakening now, the snow falling straighter instead of horizontal, the wind's howl dropping to a mere cry. By tomorrow, maybe the day after, he'd be able to leave. He'd be able to ride back down the mountain and return to his life, carrying this knowledge with him. But what would he do with it? That was the question that had been growing in his mind since he'd first seen his mother's photographs. Did he tell anyone? His son deserved to know he'd had a grandmother who hadn't died, but had chosen to live differently. But telling his son meant rewriting family history, meant admitting that everything they'd believed was a construction, a story told to protect feelings that maybe didn't need protecting. And what about his father's memory? John Tillman had been a good man, respected in his community, remembered with affection. If Wade told the truth, that respect might change. People might judge his father for lying, for helping his wife disappear, for living a lie for nearly 30 years. Did Wade have the right to change how his father was remembered? He thought about Emma, his late wife. They'd had a good marriage, solid and comfortable. But there had been times, if he was honest with himself, when he'd wondered if comfortable was enough. Times when he'd felt the weight of routine, the sense that life was happening to him rather than him happening to life. He'd never acted on those feelings. He'd been loyal to Emma, to their vows, to the life they'd built. But he'd felt them. Maybe his mother had felt something similar, only stronger. Strong enough to act on. Strong enough to trade security for authenticity, comfort for freedom. Wade still thought she'd been wrong to leave him, wrong not to try to explain. But he was beginning to understand that right and wrong weren't always clean categories. Sometimes people did the wrong thing for reasons that made sense to them, and from the outside, all you could do was try to understand. He picked up his mother's journal again and flipped to the later entries. The ones from the 1980s. Her handwriting had gotten shakier, but the words were clear. Thomas is gone. He passed quietly in his sleep last spring, and I buried him in the meadow where we used to watch the elk. I'm more alone now than I've ever been, but strangely I don't feel lonely. We had 35 years together, Thomas and I. 35 years of waking up in a place we both chose, living a life that belonged entirely to us. How many people can say that? I regret nothing about our time together. But I regret Wade. I regret the hurt I caused him. I hope someday he understands that I didn't leave because I didn't love him. I left because I couldn't be the person I needed to be and be his mother at the same time. That's my failure, not his. The entry was dated April 1991. The last letter to his father was dated November of that year. His mother must have died shortly after, probably here in this hut, probably alone. Wade felt a tightness in his chest at the thought. Whatever else she'd done, whatever choices she'd made, she'd deserved better than to die alone in the mountains. But maybe she hadn't seen it that way. Maybe for her, dying here in the place she'd chosen was exactly right. Maybe that was the point. She'd lived on her own terms, and she'd died on them too. May walked over and bumped his leg with her nose. It was time to feed her again. Time to eat something himself. Time to tend to the practical needs that didn't stop just because the world had shifted on its axis. Wade set the journal down and got to work. On the third morning, Wade woke to silence. Not the muffled silence of a storm, but true silence. The wind had stopped. He rose from the bed where he'd slept, his mother's bed, and walked to the window. The world outside was buried in snow, transformed into something clean and new. The sun was breaking through the clouds to the east, painting the peaks gold and pink. The storm was over. He could leave now, make his way back down the mountain, but he found himself reluctant to go. There was something unfinished here, something he hadn't quite found yet. He made coffee and stood at the window, watching the light change as the sun climbed higher. May was already awake, watching him with that patient donkey expression that seemed to say she'd wait as long as needed. Good old May. She'd been with him through everything, this quiet companion who asked nothing and gave everything. Wade thought about his own life, measuring it against his mother's choices. He'd done what was expected. He'd stayed on the ranch, married a good woman, raised a son. He'd been reliable, steady, present, all the things his mother hadn't been. But had he been happy, really happy, the way Thomas and Sarah seemed to have been in those photographs and journal entries? He'd been content. That was different. Content was good enough for most people, and it had been good enough for him. He didn't regret his life. But standing here in this stone hut, reading about two people who'd burned their old lives down to build something new, he felt a strange pang. Not regret exactly, but a kind of wistfulness for roads not taken. Emma had been a good woman, a good wife. But if he was honest, truly honest, their marriage had been more partnership than passion. They'd loved each other in the way that people who've built a life together love, with familiarity and comfort and shared history. But it hadn't been the kind of love that would make someone leave everything behind. It hadn't been the kind of love that consumed and transformed. Was that good or bad? Wade didn't know anymore. His parents' passionate love had ended in abandonment and lifelong grief. His own steady love had brought stability and peace. Which was better? Maybe there was no answer. Maybe life just was what it was, and you did the best you could with what you had. He finished his coffee and decided to do one more thorough search of the hut. If he was going to leave, he wanted to make sure he hadn't missed anything important. He started with the shelves, pulling down jars and checking behind them. Then he moved to the drawers, going through each one methodically. In the bottom drawer of the cabinet, beneath a pile of dish towels, his fingers touched something that felt like canvas. He pulled it out and found a leather satchel, old but well preserved. Inside were more documents, legal papers, a marriage certificate dated 1956, showing that Sarah Tillman and Thomas Bridger had been married by a justice of the peace in a small town 50 miles from here. So they'd made it official somehow, found a way to marry without revealing who Sarah really was. there was also a will. Thomas had left everything to Sarah, and Sarah had left everything to Wade's breath caught Wade Tillman. His mother had remembered him in the end, had named him as her heir. Not that there was much to inherit beyond this hut and the land it stood on. But the gesture meant something. It meant she'd been thinking about him, planning for a time when he might find this place. Beneath the will, Wade found a sealed envelope with his name on it in his mother's handwriting. His hand trembled as he opened it. Inside was a letter dated December 1991. Dear Wade, if you're reading this, then you've found the hut. Part of me hoped you would, and part of me hoped you wouldn't. The hoping is complicated, like everything else about what I did. I don't know how to explain my choices in a way that won't sound like excuses. I don't know how to tell you about my life here without it seeming like I'm justifying abandoning you. But I need to try. When I left, you were 12 years old enough to remember me, young enough that I hoped you'd eventually move on and build a life without the weight of my unhappiness dragging you down. Your father and I agreed that letting you think I died was kinder than letting you know I chose to leave. Maybe we were wrong. Maybe we should have told you the truth and trusted you to handle it. But we did what we thought was best, and I have to live with that choice the way you have to live with its consequences. I loved you, Wade. I love you still. But I couldn't be your mother and be myself at the same time, and that failure is mine alone. Don't blame your father. He did everything he could to protect you, to give you a good life. He was a better parent than I ever was. Thomas was my second chance at life. We had 35 years together here, and they were good years. We were happy in a way I'd never been happy before. I know that probably hurts to read, but it's true, and you deserve truth even if it's painful. I hope you've had happiness in your life. I hope you found someone who loved you the way you deserve to be loved. I hope you've been a better parent than I was. And I hope someday you can understand that people are complicated, that we do our best with what we have, and that sometimes love means letting go even when it breaks your heart. The hut is yours now if you want it. You can keep it or burn it or leave it to the mountain. That choice is yours the way so many choices weren't. Be well, my son. Live the life that's true to you, whatever that means. Your mother, Sarah. Wade read the letter 3 times, each word settling into him like snow. His mother had known he'd come here eventually. She'd left this for him, this final message, this attempt at explanation. It didn't erase the hurt or the anger or the confusion, but it helped. It helped to know that she'd thought about him, that she'd cared about his judgment of her. He folded the letter carefully and put it back in its envelope. Then he walked around the hut one more time, looking at everything with new eyes. This place his mother had chosen over him. This place that had made her happy in a way her old life never had. It was beautiful. He had to admit that. Simple but complete, isolated but not lonely. He could see the appeal, especially for someone who'd felt trapped by expectations and convention. Up here, there were no neighbors to judge, no social rules to follow, no roles to play. Just stone and wood and mountain, and the person you chose to share it with. Wade walked to the door and opened it. The cold air rushed in, clean and sharp. He'd have to dig May out, clear a path down to where the trail began. It would take most of the day to make the descent, and he'd have to be careful. The snow would be deep and unstable in places, but he'd make it. He always made it. That was who he was, the man who endured, who persevered, who saw things through. His mother had been the one who left when things got hard. Wade was the one who stayed. Was that better? Was that worse? He still didn't know, but it was who he was, and at 72, there wasn't much point in trying to be someone different. Wade was preparing to leave, packing his saddlebags and getting May ready for the descent, when he noticed something odd. The stone above the hearth, the one that formed the mantel, had a small gap along one edge. He'd seen it before, but hadn't thought much of it. Now, in the bright morning light, he could see that the gap was deliberate, that the stone could be moved. He reached up and worked his fingers into the gap, pulling gently. The stone shifted, then slid out, revealing a hollow space behind it. Inside was a metal box, the kind used for storing important documents. Wade pulled it out and carried it to the table, his heart beating faster. The box wasn't locked. Inside, he found more letters, but these were different from the others. They were unopened, still in their envelopes, and they were addressed to Wade at his ranch. The return address showed Sarah Bridger, Cedar Springs, Montana, with a post office box number. The postmarks ranged from 1975 to 1980. Wade stared at the envelopes, his mind racing. His mother had written to him. She'd written to him when he was in his 30s, when he was married with a young son of his own. And somehow these letters had ended up back here, still sealed, never delivered. His hands shook as he opened the first one, dated June 1975. Dear Wade, I know this letter may come as a shock. I know what you believe about me, what you've believed for 20 years. I'm not dead. I've been living in the mountains with a man named Thomas Bridger. We have a small place far from everything. I left when you were 12 years old, and I know that what I did was unforgivable. But you're a grown man now with a family of your own, and I thought maybe it was time you knew the truth. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect you to want to see me or know me, but I thought you deserved to know that I didn't die in that storm. I chose to leave, and I've been alive all this time. If you want to write back, you can reach me at the address on the envelope. If you don't, I'll understand. Your mother, Sarah. Wade's vision blurred. He blinked hard and opened the next letter from August 1975. Wade, I haven't heard from you, and I understand. What I told you in my last letter must have been a terrible shock. Maybe you don't want anything to do with me, and that's fair. But I want you to know more about why I left. It wasn't because I didn't love you. I did love you, more than I knew how to handle. But I was drowning in the life I had, becoming less and less of a real person every day. Thomas offered me a way out, a way to live authentically. I took it and I hurt you in the process. That will always be my greatest regret. But I can't regret the life I've built here. Does that make sense? I hope it does. I hope you found your own authentic life, whatever that looks like for you. Sarah, there were 6 more letters, each one dated a few months after the last. His mother had written to him 8 times over the course of 5 years, trying to explain, trying to connect, asking if he wanted to meet, saying she understood if he didn't. And then, in the last letter dated March 1980, Wade, this is my last letter. Your father wrote to me last month. He asked me to stop writing to you. He said the letters were upsetting you, bringing up old pain that had finally healed. He said you had a good life, a wife and son you loved, and that my presence in your life, even through letters, was damaging that. He asked me as a final favor to let you go completely, to let you keep believing I was dead. He said that was what you wanted, what you needed. So this is my goodbye. I'll stop writing. I'll let you live your life without the ghost of your mother hovering at the edges. But I want you to know that I'll be thinking of you always. That somewhere in these mountains there's a woman who loves you and wishes you well, even if you never know she exists. Be happy, Wade. That's all I ever wanted for you. Sarah. Wade sat back in his chair, the letter trembling in his hands. His father had intercepted his mother's attempt to reconnect. His father had told her Wade didn't want to hear from her, that the letters were harmful. And Wade had never known. He'd never gotten a single letter, never had the chance to decide for himself whether he wanted to know his mother was alive. He thought back to those years, 1975 to 1980. He would have been in his mid-30s, married to Emma for several years, their son still young. Had his father received these letters and hidden them? Had he written to Sarah and lied about Wade's reaction? Wade stood and walked to the window, his mind churning. Why would his father do that? To protect Wade? To protect himself? To keep the secret buried and the past in the past? He thought about his father in those years. They'd still been close, working the ranch together, sharing the responsibilities. His father had seemed settled, at peace with his life. But maybe that peace had been built on keeping everything contained, keeping Wade from knowing the truth that would complicate everything. The more Wade thought about it, the more he realized his father must have intercepted the letters. They'd come to the ranch, and his father, who handled most of the mail, would have seen them. He would have opened them, read them, understood what they meant, and then he'd made a choice. He'd hidden them from Wade and written back to Sarah, telling her to stop, using Wade's supposed wishes as the reason. It was a betrayal. Not as dramatic as his mother's leaving, but a betrayal nonetheless. His father had taken away Wade's choice, had decided for him what he could and couldn't know, what he could and couldn't handle. All in the name of protection, probably. All in the name of love. But still a betrayal. Wade felt a surge of anger, hot and immediate. How dare his father make that decision for him? How dare he keep Wade from even knowing his mother had reached out? Wade had spent his 30s believing his mother was dead, grieving her, missing her, when all along she'd been alive and trying to connect with him. But then, slowly, the anger cooled, replaced by something more complicated. Wade thought about being a father himself. He thought about the choices he'd made for his son over the years, the times he'd hidden difficult truths or softened hard realities, all in the name of protecting the boy. He thought about the instinct that every parent has, to shield their child from pain, even when that child is grown. His father had made a choice, maybe the wrong choice, but one made out of love. He'd seen Wade building a good life, and he hadn't wanted the complications of the past to destroy that. He'd taken the burden on himself, carried the secret, dealt with Sarah's letters, and kept Wade in the dark. It was controlling, yes. It was paternalistic. But it also came from a place of deep care. Wade picked up the letters again and read through them more carefully. His mother's voice came through clear, regretful but not apologetic for her choices, wanting connection but respecting distance, trying to explain something that maybe couldn't be fully explained. She'd made an effort. She'd tried. And she'd been turned away, not by Wade, but by Wade's father, acting as gatekeeper. What would Wade have done if he'd received these letters in his 30s? Would he have written back? Would he have wanted to meet his mother, to hear her side of things? Or would he have been angry, wounded all over again, unable to forgive? He didn't know. He couldn't know. The choice had been taken from him, and now, 40 years later, he was left with only hypotheticals. But one thing was clear. His father had carried this burden alone. He'd intercepted the letters, responded to Sarah, kept Wade ignorant and never told anyone. He died with the secret, adding this deception to all the others. It must have been exhausting, keeping track of all the lies, maintaining the fiction that Sarah had died in 1955 when she'd been writing letters from a post office box in 1975. Wade walked back to the metal box and looked inside to see if there was anything else. At the bottom, beneath the letters, he found one more envelope. This one was addressed to him in his father's handwriting. It was sealed, and across the front was written, "For Wade to be opened only if he finds Sarah's letters." Wade's hands were steadier now as he opened this final envelope. Inside was a single page, his father's careful script. "Son, if you're reading this, then you've found the hut and you've found your mother's letters. I imagine you're angry with me right now. You have every right to be. I made a choice to keep those letters from you, and I've had to live with that choice every day since. I did it because I thought it was right. You were happy. You had Emma and your boy and the ranch. You'd built a good life on top of the grief of losing your mother. I didn't want to tear that foundation away. I didn't want you to have to choose between the life you had and the mother who'd come back. So I chose for you. Maybe that was wrong. Maybe I should have trusted you to handle the truth. But I couldn't take that risk. I loved you too much to watch you hurt all over again. I hope you can forgive me. I hope you can understand that everything I did, every lie I told, every secret I kept, was because you were my son, and I wanted to protect you. That's what fathers do, even when it's wrong, even when it costs them. Your father, John Tillman." Wade folded the letter and sat in silence. Outside, May huffed impatiently, ready to go. The sun was climbing higher. If they were going to make the descent today, they needed to start soon. But Wade sat at the table, surrounded by the letters and secrets of 2 generations, and tried to make sense of it all. Wade spent the next hour sitting at the table. The letters spread before him like pieces of a puzzle that would never quite fit together. The sun climbed higher, and May grew more restless, but he couldn't seem to move. His whole life felt like it needed reordering, every memory reconsidered in light of what he now knew. His mother had wanted to reconnect. His father had prevented it. Both of them had their reasons. Both of them had been trying in their own ways to do right by him. And both of them had failed in ways they probably never fully understood. Finally, he stood. Sitting here wouldn't change anything. The past was the past, fixed and immutable. What mattered now was what he did next, how he carried this knowledge forward. He gathered all the letters, his mother's to his father, his father's to his mother's undelivered attempts to reach Wade, his father's final explanation, and put them back in their respective containers. He placed them in his saddlebag. These were his now, part of his inheritance, part of the story he'd carry with him down the mountain. Then he walked around the hut one more time, looking at everything his mother and Thomas had built. The shelves with their carefully preserved supplies, the bed with its thick blankets, the stove that still held warmth, the photographs on the wall. This place had been a haven, a refuge, a home for 35 years. It had given his mother something she couldn't find anywhere else. And now it was his, legally his according to her will. What should he do with it? Sell it? Impossible. Who would buy a stone hut high in the mountains, accessible only by difficult trails? Abandon it? Let the mountain reclaim it, the roof eventually collapsing under snow, the walls slowly crumbling. That felt wrong, like erasing his mother's memory entirely. Or keep it. Come back here sometimes, maintain it, preserve it as a testament to two people who'd chosen to live differently. That felt right, but also complicated. He was 72 years old. How many more times would he be able to make this journey? And when he was gone, who would care for it then? His son. The thought came to him clearly. He could tell his son about this place, about the grandmother who hadn't died but had chosen a different life. He could bring him here, show him the hut, share the letters. Let his son decide what it meant, what should be done with it. But that meant revealing everything. That meant tearing down the story his son had always believed about his grandmother's death. That meant complicating the memory of Wade's father, the grandfather his son had known and loved. Was that fair? Did his son have a right to know? Or did Wade have a right to protect him from difficult truths, the same way his father had tried to protect Wade? The same questions, Wade realized. The same impossible choices that his father had faced. And now, Wade understood, in a way he couldn't have before, why his father had made the decisions he'd made. It was easier to keep secrets, to maintain the simple story, to let sleeping dogs lie. Truth was messy. Truth hurt people. Truth demanded that you grapple with complexity instead of resting in comfortable certainty. But Wade had never been one to choose ease over honesty. That had been his father's way, not his. Wade had always been straightforward, sometimes bluntly so. Emma used to joke that he was constitutionally incapable of telling a lie, even a small one. He'd take that nature with him now. He'd tell his son the truth and let his son decide what to do with it. Wade walked to the hearth and knelt down, looking at the fire that had burned here for decades. He understood something now about maintenance, about care, about the daily choice to keep something alive. His mother had tended this fire every day for 35 years. She'd chopped wood, carried water, preserved food, repaired damage. She'd worked as hard here as she would have worked on the ranch, maybe harder. But it had been work she'd chosen, work that meant something to her. That was the difference, Wade realized. Not the work itself, but the choosing. His mother had needed to choose her life instead of having it chosen for her. And maybe that was worth something, even if the cost was high, even if the cost was a son who grew up without her. He stood and looked at the photographs on the wall one more time. His mother, young and then old, living out her years with Thomas. There was peace in those photographs. A contentment that Wade couldn't remember seeing in the few early photos he had of her from before she left. Maybe she'd been happy here. Maybe that mattered. Wade walked outside and found his shovel, then began the hard work of digging May out and clearing a path. The snow was deep, over 3 feet in places, heavy and wet. His back complained and his knees protested, but he kept working. May helped by trampling the snow down, her small hooves packing it into something more manageable. It took most of the morning to clear enough space to move safely. By the time he was done, Wade was sweating despite the cold, his muscles aching. He was too old for this kind of labor, his body reminded him with every movement. But he'd done it anyway, because that's what needed doing. He went back inside and made a simple meal, canned soup heated on the stove, bread that his mother had preserved somehow so that it was still good after all these years. He fed May and checked her hooves, making sure she was ready for the descent. Then he packed everything carefully, dividing the weight between his saddlebags and the pack on May's back. Before he closed the door for the last time, he walked around the hut once more. He straightened the blankets on the bed. He washed his dishes and put them back on the shelf. He added wood to the fire, damping it down so it would burn slow and eventually go out safely. He wanted to leave the place the way his mother would have wanted it. Neat, cared for, respected. On the table he left a note, weighted down with a smooth river stone. To anyone who finds this place, this was the home of Sarah Tillman Bridger and Thomas Bridger. They lived here from 1955 to 1992, by choice, in peace. The land now belongs to Wade Tillman, Sarah's son. The hut is not abandoned, it is remembered. If you need shelter, use it. If you need supplies, take what you need. But please leave it as you found it, ready for the next person who might need it. That's how Thomas and Sarah would have wanted it. Wade Tillman, November 2025. He stood at the door and looked back one more time. The fire glowing in the hearth, the afternoon sun slanting through the window, the photographs on the wall, his mother's refuge, his mother's choice, his mother's home, and now, in a way, his inheritance. He stepped outside and closed the door firmly. May stood waiting, patient as always, her breath steaming in the cold air. Wade untied her from the post and swung himself into the saddle with a grunt. Every joint complained, but he ignored them. He was old, yes, but not too old for this. Not yet. The descent would be treacherous. The snow would make the trail slippery, and there would be places where they'd have to go slow, testing each step. But they'd make it. Wade knew these mountains, and May knew how to navigate difficult terrain. They'd be fine. As they started down the trail, Wade turned back once and looked at the stone hut. From this angle, with the sun hitting it just right, it almost glowed. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin line, the last breath of the fire he'd left burning. It looked like a place from a story, something that existed outside of time. His mother had lived there. His mother had been happy there. And now Wade knew, and the knowing changed everything and nothing at the same time. He thought about his father, dying of cancer, drawing the map, leaving it for Wade to find when he was ready. His father had wanted Wade to know eventually. He'd just wanted to control when and how. That was like his father, trying to manage things, trying to protect people, even from beyond the grave. Wade forgave him. The thought came clear and certain. He forgave his father for the lies and the secrets and the intercepted letters. He forgave his mother for leaving and for the decades of absence. He forgave them both for being human, for making mistakes, for doing the best they could with impossible situations. And he forgave himself too, for the anger he'd felt, for the judgment he'd passed, for thinking that his way of living was somehow better or more right than theirs. They'd all done what they could. They'd all been trying to find meaning, to build lives that made sense, to love as best they knew how. May picked her way down the trail, sure-footed despite the snow. Wade let her lead, trusting her instincts. Behind them, the hut disappeared into the trees. Ahead, the valley opened up, stretching toward home and whatever came next. Wade had decisions to make. He'd call his son when he got back to civilization. They'd have a long talk, and Wade would tell him everything, about his grandmother who hadn't died, about the great-grandfather who'd kept secrets, about the stone hut high in the mountains where two people had built a life on their own terms. His son deserved to know his history, the real history, complicated and messy as it was, and then his son could decide what to do with that knowledge, just as Wade was deciding now. The sun was past its peak when they reached the tree line, entering the forest of aspens and pines. The snow was lighter here, filtered by the canopy above. Wade could see tracks, elk, maybe a mountain lion, marking the fresh snow. Life continuing, as it always did, regardless of human drama. He thought about Emma, wished she was here to talk this through with him. She'd always been good at helping him sort through complicated feelings, at finding the sense in things that seemed senseless. She'd have known what to say about his mother, about his father, about the choices people make and the prices they pay. But Emma was gone, and Wade was on his own. That was all right. He'd been on his own for 2 years now, and he'd learned to be his own counsel, his own comfort. It wasn't the same as having a partner, but it was enough. The afternoon wore on, and they kept descending, the mountain slowly releasing them from its grip. They were about halfway down the mountain when Wade saw the smoke, just a thin line rising from a stand of pines off to the east of the main trail. He pulled May to a stop and stared at it. Someone had a fire going, which meant someone was camping in weather that wasn't fit for casual camping. Either someone in trouble or someone who knew these mountains well enough to not be bothered by a late-season storm. Wade sat in his saddle, debating. The smart thing would be to keep moving, get off the mountain before dark, make camp in lower country where the snow wasn't as deep. But something pulled at him. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the mountain code that said you checked on anyone you encountered in the high country. Maybe something else. He turned May toward the smoke. It took 20 minutes of careful navigation through deep snow to reach the campsite. As they approached, Wade saw a small canvas tent set up beneath the pines, a fire burning in a carefully built rock ring. An older man sat on a log near the fire, a tin cup in his hands. He looked up as Wade and May approached, showing no surprise, as if he'd been expecting them. The man was probably in his 80s, weathered and lean in the way that mountain people get when they've spent most of their lives outdoors. He had a white beard, neat and trimmed, and eyes that were sharp despite his age. "That's far enough," the man said, his voice carrying easily across the snow. "Unless you're friendly, in which case you're welcome to share my fire." "I'm friendly," Wade said. He dismounted and led May closer. "Name's Wade Tillman." The old man's eyes widened slightly. "Tillman," he repeated. "Sarah's boy." Wade stopped. "You knew my mother?" "Knew both of them, Thomas and Sarah. I'm Frank Carson. Used to trap these mountains before my knees told me to quit. I'd stop by their place twice a year, regular as seasons. Last saw your mother in 91, just a few months before she passed." Wade stood there, snow falling softly around them, and felt the world shift again. This man had known his mother, had visited the hut, had been part of that small community of mountain dwellers who'd kept her secret. "Sit down," Frank said, gesturing to another log. "You look like you've got some thinking to do, and thinking goes better by a fire." Wade tied May to a tree where she could reach some exposed grass, then sat down heavily. Frank poured coffee from a pot that sat near the fire and handed Wade a cup. "It was strong and bitter and perfect. You've been to the hut," Frank said. "It wasn't a question." 3 days there, Wade confirmed. "Storm caught us. Storm catches everyone eventually. That's what the mountains do. They make you stop and face things you've been running from." Frank sipped his coffee. "Your mother was a good woman. Thomas was a good man. They deserved better than to be secrets." "Why did you keep it secret?" Wade asked. "All these years, why didn't anyone say anything?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Your mother asked us to. Said she'd made her choice and had to live with it, but that didn't mean everyone else needed to know. Thomas never cared one way or another. He would have shouted it from the peaks if she'd wanted, but she didn't want. So we respected that, even after she died. Especially after she died. What good would it have done to tell anyone then? She was gone. Thomas was gone. The life they'd built was finished. Seemed to me that was their story to tell, and if they'd chosen not to tell it, that was their right." Wade took a drink of coffee. "My father knew. He knew the whole time." "Course he did. He and Thomas worked it out between them. Your father could have made trouble if he'd wanted. Could have dragged Sarah back or exposed her or any number of things. But he didn't. He let her go, Let her live the life she needed to live. That took strength most men don't have. He kept it from me, Wade said. She tried to write to me, and he intercepted the letters. Frank nodded slowly. I knew about that. Your mother told me. She was hurt by it, but she understood. Your father was protecting you the only way he knew how. By lying to me? By taking away my choice? By carrying the burden himself, Frank said. Your father could have told you the truth and made it your problem. Instead, he kept it his problem. He dealt with your mother's letters. He maintained the fiction. He carried the weight of it all so you didn't have to. That's what parents do, son. They carry what their children can't, even when it breaks them. Wade stared into his coffee. Around them, the mountain was quiet, except for the soft sound of snow falling through branches. You're angry, Frank said after a while. That's natural. But let me ask you something. If your father had given you those letters back in '75, if you'd known your mother was alive, what would you have done? Wade thought about it, really thought about it. I don't know. I was 35, had a wife and a young son. I'd built my life on thinking she was dead, finding out she wasn't, that she'd chosen to leave. I think it would have destroyed me. Exactly, Frank said. Your father knew that. He knew you well enough to know that the truth would have been poison at that point in your life, so he took the poison himself and let you keep living. But I had a right to know. Did you? Frank asked gently. Is there some cosmic law that says we have a right to every difficult truth, every painful reality? Or is it possible that sometimes love means protecting people from truths they can't handle? Wade didn't answer. He couldn't. Frank added more wood to the fire. Your mother used to talk about you. Every time I visited, she'd ask if I'd heard anything, seen anything, knew anything about how you were doing. She'd get this look on her face, sad and proud at the same time. She loved you, Wade. Never doubt that. If she loved me, she wouldn't have left. Love isn't that simple. You're old enough to know that. Sometimes love means staying, and sometimes it means leaving. Your mother was dying inside in that old life. She would have withered away to nothing if she'd stayed. Is that what you would have wanted? A mother who was physically present but spiritually gone? Wade thought about his own life, his marriage to Emma. It had been good, but what if it hadn't been? What if he'd been miserable but stayed anyway, out of duty or obligation? Would his son have been better off with a father who was there but not really there? She could have taken me with her, Wade said, though even as he said it he knew. How ridiculous it sounded. Could she? Frank asked. A 12-year-old boy living in a stone hut in the mountains with no school, no friends, no life beyond survival. That wouldn't have been love. That would have been selfishness. No, she left you where you could grow, where you could have a real life. She sacrificed being your mother so you could have a father and a future. Wade felt something shift in his chest, some hardness beginning to crack. I wanted to hate her, he said quietly. When I first found the hut, saw the photographs, read the letters, I wanted to hate her for leaving me. But you don't, Frank said. It wasn't a question. No, I'm angry and I'm hurt and I'm confused, but I don't hate her. I think, Wade paused, working through the thought. I think I understand her. Not the leaving exactly, but the needing to leave. The needing to find a life that was really hers. Frank nodded. That's wisdom talking. Wisdom knows that people are complicated, that situations rarely have clean answers, that love takes 100 different forms. They sat in silence for a while, drinking coffee, watching the fire. Finally, Wade said, "What am I supposed to do now? With what I know? What do you want to do?" "I want to tell my son. He has a right to know about his grandmother, to know the real story." "Then tell him. But tell him with the same understanding you've found here. Don't tell him out of anger or a need to set records straight. Tell him because the truth, even painful truth, is worth knowing, and tell him about all of it. Your mother's choice, your father's protection, the complexity of it all." Wade thought about his son, about the conversation they'd need to have. It wouldn't be easy. His son would have his own feelings to work through, his own anger and confusion and grief. But Wade would be there to help him through it, the way Frank was helping Wade through it now. The hut, Wade said. It belongs to me now, legally. My mother left it to me in her will. What should I do with it? Frank smiled. What do you want to do with it? Keep it. Maintain it. Maybe bring my son up here someday. Show him where his grandmother lived. Then do that. The mountain will be here. The hut will be here. And when you're gone, maybe your son will keep it going, or maybe he'll let it return to the mountain. Either way, it served its purpose. It gave your mother a place to be herself. That's worth preserving. Wade stood, feeling the stiffness in his legs, the ache in his back. Old age wasn't for the weak. But then neither was living. Neither was facing hard truths and making peace with them. Thank you, he said to Frank, for the coffee and the conversation. Thank your mother, Frank said. She's the one who asked me to keep an eye out for you if you ever came up here. She said if her boy ever made it to the hut, he might need someone to talk to on the way down. Wade stared at the old man. She knew I'd come, she hoped. There's a difference, but hope's a powerful thing in the mountains. Sometimes it's all that keeps you alive. Wade nodded, understanding more than he could put into words. He untied May and swung into the saddle. Frank raised his cup in salute, and Wade returned the gesture. Then he turned May back toward the trail and continued his descent, carrying his mother's hope with him down the mountain. Wade made it off the mountain 2 days later, reaching the small town of Cedar Springs as the sun was setting. May walked into town like she owned it, her head high despite the hard journey. They'd both earned their rest. He found a stable that would board May for the night, made sure she had food and water and a warm place to sleep. Then he got himself a room at the only motel in town, showered off 3 days of mountain grit, and sat on the edge of the bed with his phone in his hands. His son answered on the 3rd ring. "Dad, where are you? I've been trying to reach you for days." "I'm fine," Wade said. "I was up in the mountains. No cell service." "You shouldn't be going up there alone at your age," his son said, worry evident in his voice. "What if something had happened?" "Something did happen," Wade said. "That's why I'm calling. I need to tell you about your grandmother." There was a pause. "Grandma Emma? What about her?" "No, not Emma. My mother. Your other grandmother, Sarah." Another pause, longer this time. "Dad, Grandma Sarah died before I was born, before you even met Mom." "That's what I always believed too," Wade said. "But it isn't true. She didn't die in that storm. She left, and she lived for another 36 years in a stone hut in the Sawtooth Range. I just came from there." He heard his son take a breath, preparing to argue or question or express disbelief. But Wade kept talking, telling the story from beginning to end. The map, the storm, finding the hut, the photographs, the letters, all of it. He told it simply, without judgment, letting the facts speak for themselves. When he finished, his son was quiet for a long time. Finally, Grandpa John knew. He knew. He helped her disappear, and then he kept the secret for the rest of his life. Why didn't he tell us? Because he was trying to protect me, and maybe protecting himself too. It's complicated, son. People are complicated. "Are you okay?" his son asked. "This must have been, I can't even imagine." "I'm okay," Wade said, and realized it was true. "I was angry at first, then hurt, then confused, but I'm okay now. I understand better than I did. Your grandmother needed a different life, and she found it. Your grandfather carried the burden of that, so I wouldn't have to. They both did what they thought was right." "What are you going to do? Are you going to tell people, go public with it?" "No," Wade said. "This is family business. I'm telling you because you have a right to know your history, the real history. But beyond that, I think the story can rest. Your grandmother and Thomas lived quietly, and they can stay quiet. The hut's still there? It is. It belongs to me now, legally. Your grandmother left it to me in her will. I'm thinking I'll keep it, maintain it. Maybe we could go up there together sometime if you wanted. I could show you where she lived, what she built." His son was quiet again, processing. Then, "I'd like that. I'd like to see it." "Good," Wade said. "We'll plan it for next summer when the weather's better. Bring your kids if you want. Their great-grandmother was an interesting woman. They should know about her. They talked for a while longer, his son asking questions, Wade answering as best he could. When they finally hung up, Wade felt lighter somehow, as if sharing the story had distributed its weight across more shoulders. He lay back on the motel bed and stared at the ceiling. Outside, he could hear the sounds of the small town, cars passing, voices from the street, the ordinary sounds of ordinary life. He'd been gone less than a week, but it felt like longer. It felt like he'd traveled much farther than just into the mountains. He thought about his mother, about the last years of her life alone in the hut after Thomas died. Had she been happy? Had she regretted her choices? He'd never know for sure. But he thought about that note he'd found, the one where she'd written that she was tired and ready to rest. There'd been peace in those words. Acceptance. That's what Wade felt now. Acceptance. His mother had made her choice, and his father had made his, and Wade had lived the life that resulted from those choices. It hadn't been a bad life. It had been a good life, actually. He'd had love and work and purpose. He'd raised a son and buried a wife and spent 72 years learning how to be human in a complicated world. The next morning, Wade collected May from the stable and started the long ride home. The sun was bright, the air cold and clear. May walked with her usual steady gait, and Wade let his mind wander across the past and the future and the strange, winding path that connected them. He thought about going back to the hut someday. Maybe, in the spring when the wildflowers were blooming in the meadow below it. He'd bring supplies, do some repairs, make sure it was sound for another winter. It was his responsibility now, part of his inheritance. Not just the physical structure, but the story it held, the lives it had sheltered, the choices it represented. People spend their whole lives looking for meaning, Wade thought, looking for purpose, for connection, for a sense that their existence matters. His mother had found hers in a stone hut with a man who loved her enough to let her be herself. His father had found his in protecting his son, even at great personal cost. And Wade had found his in the quiet work of living honestly, raising his family, tending to what needed tending. None of it was simple, none of it was perfect, but it was real, and it was theirs. And that was enough. As the miles passed beneath May's hooves, Wade felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, but something close to it. Peace, maybe, or acceptance. Or simply the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd gone looking for answers and found something better, understanding. The mountains rose behind him, already distant, already becoming memory, but they'd be there when he returned, patient and permanent, holding their secrets and their stories until someone was ready to hear them. That was the way of mountains. That was the way of truth. It waited, and when you were ready, it let itself be found.